Gary will be giving us our sermon now. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We're glad that he's here, and we're glad his friends are here with him.
Thank you, Albert. A few months back, I was working on a room in our house, and I like to listen to sermons when I'm working. And I've listened to just about every Doug Batchelor sermon that I can get on the internet and everything. And so every once in a while, I'll get from another faith a sermon. And I just happened to get on one that a preacher was preaching on John 9. It was about Jesus healing the blind man on the Sabbath. Very good sermon. I really enjoyed it. And toward the end, the preacher made a statement that Jesus had a hard time keeping the Sabbath. I said out loud, "No, he didn't. He was the author and the creator of the Sabbath. He knew exactly what to do and not to do." In Matthew 12:8, Jesus said, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." What the problem was, it wasn't Jesus had the problem, it was the problem the Pharisees had the problem because Jesus wasn't keeping the Sabbath the way they thought that he should. And we know all about the Pharisees, that they had, I forget how many extra rules that you could do as far as carrying a burden and how far you could travel and things like that. So, Matthew 15:9, Jesus told the Pharisees, "But in vain you do worship me, teaching for doctrines the traditions of men." And that's what they were doing. They were basically teaching their doctrines, not the doctrines that God wanted them to teach, but they made up their own rules. Let's turn to Exodus 20, verse 8 to 11. We all know this, fourth commandment. "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Now, if you think I'm going to get up here and tell you which day the Sabbath is, I'm not doing that. We're all here today because we know what day the Sabbath day is. We're not worshiping tomorrow, we're worshiping today. But it's on how do we observe the Sabbath. I think a lot of Adventists reads the fourth commandment as, "Remember the Sabbath day to go to church." Now I'm going to make a statement, and I'm sure that somebody's going to disagree with me, maybe all of you. And I've prayed about this, and I've done research, so I'm going to make it anyway. I'm a little bit like John in that way. Now, if you disagree with my statement, let me elaborate on it before you kick me out of my ear, okay? There's nowhere in the fourth commandment to tell us to go to church. Yeah, I'm going to study your faces a little bit. I see some concern, maybe some disbelief. But there isn't. Read it again. What it's talking about is a day of rest. It's a memorial to God to not forget that He's the one that made the heavens and the earth. I was listening to a Doug Batchelor sermon that he had broadcast in 2011. And it was about the Sabbath. And Doug was all up in arms about an article that came out in the Review a few months before he gave this sermon. And what the article in the Review was about, somebody had written an article that people can keep the Sabbath as home just as well as they could going to church. Now, Doug was up in the air about it. He says, you know, it's bad enough for preachers now, but when you have the Review saying you don't even have to go to church, he says, what are the preachers to do? Now, I agree with Doug. But he referred to Leviticus 23:3. Now, I had studied this verse, and I was planning on using it in the sermon anyway. But turn to Leviticus 23, verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest at holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in your dwellings. Now, he said that the word convocation means, that's where we get our word convention from, a gathering of people. So I looked it up in the dictionary. Okay, what exactly does this mean? And it's a gathering of people. But it don't have to be a large gathering. It can be a small gathering. It can still be a convocation. See, I'm very literal in how I read things. And when I read something in the scriptures, I don't try to make out what they're trying to say. To me, the Bible is clear enough. We can read the words in the Bible and know what it's saying. And when it says here, a convocation in your dwelling, it means that they were convocating in their tents where they lived. They might have brought their family together. In Exodus 19:6, the Lord told Moses to tell the people before he even gave the Ten Commandments that I will make you a kingdom of priests. Now, he set up the Aaronic priesthood, but he told the whole gathering, I will make you a kingdom of priests. What exactly does that mean? In the Adventist Home on page 212, Ellen White elaborates on this. She says the father, the husband, is supposed to be priest of the home. It's up to the priest of the home to get his family together to have morning and evening devotionals. So when they're talking about convocating in your home, it's not that they had to go to the sanctuary to listen to a sermon, because basically in the sanctuary at that time, the priests were doing their sanctuary duties. They weren't preaching to the people. They had things they needed to do for sacrifices and stuff like that. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that we should go to church. And there's too much evidence in the Bible about that. Art brought up this morning about Jesus when he went to the synagogue to get up to read on the Sabbath, as it was his custom. Now, I've done some searching about synagogues. Synagogue means church. It can mean a building, or it can mean a group of people, just like we use church today. The synagogues probably weren't built, the research I've done, weren't they didn't have synagogues until after the Babylonian captivity, when the people were more dispersed. They didn't have a temple at the time. They had to rebuild the temple. And so the people built up synagogues, and they had their rabbis, the teachers, to teach them in the synagogues. And it became a regular practice throughout the ages. And by the time that Jesus walked the earth, there was a lot of synagogues in all the little towns and everything. They didn't go to the temple to worship all the time. They went to their synagogues. See, Jesus came down to establish the church in his name. I heard a lot of people today saying, well, I don't think God expects us to go to church if we really don't have to. I can be just as good a Christian at home as I can at church. Well, I think, did Jesus just waste his time then? He's the one that established the church. Did he say, okay, when the apostles are all dead and gone, this thing's going to collapse, forget about going to church? No. He meant for us to go to church until his coming. Paul writes in Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. Dear friends, to me, there's something lacking on the Sabbath if I can't make it to church. When I was sick with cancer, I don't know, it was over a year, I couldn't go to church. Either I was in the hospital or I just didn't have enough strength to hardly move. And I tell you, watching 3ABN on the Sabbath and getting sermons from that's good, but it's not like going to church and mingling with fellow believers. I love Sabbath school class. I love the give and take that you get from Sabbath school. A lot of times I get more out of Sabbath school than I do the preaching service. That's probably a bad thing to say, but it's true. But I'm the type, I love to discuss things, to get other people's ideas. Another thing that I want to establish before I get into this, what is our thinking about the Sabbath? How do we react? In 1 Samuel 15, there's a story of Saul and the Amalekites. We all know the story. I'll just go through it briefly. But Saul was told by Samuel to go out and destroy the Amalekites. And what he told him to do, he says, wipe them all out. Wipe the cattle out, wipe everything they have. Completely wipe them off the face of the nation. Well, Saul in his judgment done part of what Samuel told him to do. But he left the king alive, Agag. And then he said, well, I think I'm going to keep some of the good cattle so I can sacrifice. That'll make God happy. I'll do sacrifices. That should please God. Let me see here. I've got to find my place. So when Samuel came, and Samuel had delayed his coming, and there was smoke coming up, as Samuel got there, and Samuel looked around and says, what's going on? And Saul said, I'm doing what God has told me to do. He says, what's that smoke? He said, I'm offering sacrifices. What's that bleating I hear? Oh, we saved the best for God to sacrifice to him. Then Samuel found out the king was still alive, King Agag. Now, did that make God happy? Sure upset Samuel. But what about God? God's the one that told Samuel to tell him to do all these things. In verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15, Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to hearken than the fat of the lambs. Did Saul obey what he was supposed to do? Was he doing bad things? No, in any other circumstances, it would have probably been acceptable. But he was disobeying God. You know, I don't believe that we keep the 10 Commandments to save us. I think we keep the 10 Commandments because we are saved. And we want to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. He died on the cross. We are saved by the blood of Jesus through our faith. We want to do these things because we love Jesus and want to please him. Let's go to the rich young ruler in Matthew 19. All know that story too. Rich young ruler came to Jesus, says, "Oh, good rabbi, what must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus looked at him and he says, "Well, keep the commandments." And he went through several of the commandments. And the rich young ruler said, "Oh, I've done these ever since I've been a child." And I think he probably kind of put out his chest a little bit and said, "Man, I'm doing good. That's what Jesus tells me I have to do. I'm doing okay." Then Jesus told him, he says, "Listen, so I'm going to give you one other commandment, and this is just for you." And God will do that for us. He will give us each an individual command. It don't have to be to everybody. He looked at him and says, "Listen, go and sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me." It says a rich young man walked away sorrowfully. Why? Because he had great wealth. And his wealth was more important to him than having a relationship with Jesus. We had a pastor in Anderson for 10 years, Pastor Meharry. Good pastor. I really liked him. He was there from 1997 to 2007. And his main theme, and I tell you, if you went to church there, and if you didn't get this main theme, what he was trying to tell us for 10 years, then you just weren't listening, because he would bring it up all the time. The main theme was God wanted from us perfect obedience. God wants us to obey. Let's turn to 1 John 2, verses 3 to 6. I put my markers in my Bible, and now I can't find them. Pretty bad. 1 John 2, verses 3 to 6. "And hereby we do know that we know him if we do" what? "Keep his commandments. And he saith, I know excuse me. He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoso keepeth his word, in him verily is the love of God perfected. Hereby know we that we are in him. He that saith he abideth in him ought himself also to walk, even as he had walked." It says, we know that we know him if we keep his commandments. That will be perfected in us. And the only way to perfect something is to practice it. The only way to perfect on keeping the Sabbath is to keep it and keep it in the correct way. So, obedience. If we don't want to obey, you might as well just not even look at the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments will not save you. It's our obedience to them that will save us. And God will even give us the desire to want to keep the commandments. In Exodus 16, we have the story of the manna. Now, after a month and a half after leaving Egypt, God started hearing the people complain. Oh, we just should have stayed in Egypt because we're just going to starve out here. Where is their faith? God told him, he said, well, I'm going to send you some bread in the mornings. He says, I'll give you meat in the evenings. And he says, I'm going to take care of you. Don't you worry. I'm going to take care of you. God was sympathetic to their moanings and groanings. So they went out one day in the morning and they saw this stuff all over the ground. And you know what they said? What is it? And basically that's the meaning of manna. What is it? It was the bread that God gave them. Karen, in my bag is the seeds. It's in the side. What they saw on the ground that day was a substance that was the size of a coriander seed. Now, I'm sending around coranders. I didn't even know what they were. And so Karen and I went to the grocery, and she found some. I thought, aha, I can show them better than I can explain them. But as you see, they're small. Very small. They were white in color. It says it was the color of bedlam. After the heat of the sun came out, they would melt. They fell on the ground in the morning as like dew. It said they had the taste of wafers made with honey. And in Leviticus, it says they had the taste of fresh oil. Now, I really don't know if they ate it without doing something, but in Leviticus, it says they ground it into mills or beat it in a mortar or baked it in pans, and they made cakes out of it. So, God told him, he says, I'm going to send this on every day, 6 days. Now, on that 6th day, you go out and collect twice as much. How much was they supposed to collect? It says an omer. What's an omer? It's about a half a gallon per person that they were supposed to collect, per person in their household. Now, you can see how small these was, and Art is really studying them. As you see, they're very small. They're in the desert. There's sand in the desert. Now, I can imagine that picking this stuff up, that they might probably got some sand in with it too. So it was quite a chore to collect this. And then they had to go and they had to prepare it And you can kind of understand why God told them, collect twice as much on the preparation day, which we call Friday, because I don't want you doing all that on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day of rest. Don't go out and collect it on the Sabbath. Well, some still didn't believe. They collected it as they normally did, and then some of them even went out on the Sabbath day and looked for it. God saw this and told Moses, he says, you know, how long will they refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? Now, this is before the Ten Commandments ever came down from Mount Sinai. And God's telling them, you know, he had given them commandments and laws as their journey went on. How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my law? And then in Exodus 16, verse 29, it says, see, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. There again, he is trying to point out obedience. I was doing some research on this and reading some commentaries, and I came across something which sometimes you don't know where they get their information from, but I got kind of a chuckle out of this. A couple of commentaries said that there was basically 3 types of people that took this to stay in your place on the Sabbath. Don't go out of your place. And I kind of think, well, people back then aren't any different than people today. We have our radicals, we have our conservatives, and we have our liberals. Now, we have that in religion, we have that in politics, and either you're probably one of the 3. You just got to figure out which one you are. And this one commentary said that there was a group of people that took this very literally. That they said, when they said to stay in your place, that what position they were in when the Sabbath fell on Friday, they stayed in that same position until the sun went down on Saturday. To me, that's a little bit hard to believe. But that would be your radicals. Your conservatives, they took it a little bit better. They said, well, if they're telling us to stay in our place, and then I'm going to stay in my tent and not go out of it for the Sabbath. And then you have your liberals. Well, I think God means I can go out and walk around and everything else, as long as I don't go out of the camp. Now, basically, I'm a conservative. If I was back in those days, I'd probably think, I better stay in my tent. But we know that they went outside of their tents, and they walked around the camp area. And basically, that's where they come up with the Sabbath day's journey in the New Testament, is that they could walk around the camp but not go outside of the camp. And they said that the camp was about 2,000 cubits, or about 2/3 of a mile, that they could walk in the New Testament without breaking the Sabbath in. Now, I got 10 minutes. I told my wife that I would quit in 10 minutes, and I've got 3 more pages. I'm still going to try to make that deadline. I've broken down the 4th commandment into 3 categories. Today, I'm going to hit on pleasures. I was going to hit on all 3, but I can't make it. I had 7 pages of notes before I made the final draft, and after I got to the 2nd page, I had 4 pages And I've got 7 pages now, and I was only a third way through the... So, the 3 categories is pleasures, work, and buying and selling. Now, I'm not here to tell you what you can do or not do on the Sabbath. I'm sure that I probably do things that you would look at me and say, I question that. And I could look at you and say, whoa, I question you too. So I'm not here to tell you what to do or what not to do. That's between you and God. But I believe that the Bible gives us instructions about how we were supposed to observe it. You see, we are all different with different backgrounds. I was raised in an Adventist home. That's all I've ever known was Adventism. My mom basically gave us the instruction. When I was born, for some reason, my dad felt that he didn't have to go to church anymore, and for the next 7 years, he didn't. So it was up to my mom to give us our training. Let's turn to Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. Now, Isaiah, if you read the first chapter of Isaiah, he was called upon the last of the kings of Judah. He was basically one of the last prophets before Judah was taken over by Babylon. And if you read chapter 1 of Isaiah, Judah was in sad shape. They didn't seem like they were following God no more than a man in the moon. Now, when he wrote Isaiah 58, this is close to 60 years after chapter 1. Isaiah is not a young man anymore, but yet he's still giving them the same message over 60 years. And one of the things that he is telling them in this verse, let's read it. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasures, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. It says, if thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath. Some commentator says that this is talking about traveling. You can't travel on the Sabbath. I don't think that's what it means at all. I mean that if you turn your foot to go your own way and turn away from the Sabbath and do your own pleasures, you're not pleasing God. That you're supposed to call the Sabbath a delight. Now, I was raised that on Friday, preparation day, our baths were taken, the meals for the next day were fixed, the shoes were shined, which I don't do that very often anymore. But back then, I was the youngest, and it was my duty to shine the shoes every Friday. The house was to be cleaned, and the car filled with gas. We were supposed to prepare ourselves to rest on the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath, no TV or radio, no riding bikes, no playing ball, no swimming or sunbathing. I can remember my sister Bureen, that one summer she had her best friend Joyce come over on Sabbath afternoon, and they took a blanket out in the yard, and they took a book with them or something, and they didn't have their bathing suits on or anything, but they were out sitting in the sun. And I'll never forget Mom. And you know my mom. She came out there, what are you guys doing? You can't sunbathe on the sun. Get in here. She just had a fit, and I never seen Mom quite like that before. But it really upset her that they was out sitting in the sun. That's the things I didn't do. What could we do? We played Bible games, visited the sick and the shut-ins. And then when I moved to Indiana and moved to the country, in the summertime, we had woods. And I would go out and I'd spend a lot of time in the woods. Ellen White has this to say about nature. This comes from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 48, and was talking about God establishing the kingdom in the Garden of Eden, or establishing the Sabbath in the Garden of Eden. He said, God saw that the Sabbath was essential for man, even in paradise. He needed to lay aside his own interests and pursuits for one day of the seven, that he might more fully contemplate the works of God and meditate upon his power and goodness. He needed the Sabbath to remind him more vividly of God and to awaken gratitude because all that he enjoyed and possessed came from the beneficent hand of the Creator. God designed that the Sabbath shall direct the minds of men in the contemplation of his created works. Nature speaks to their senses, declaring that there is a living God, the Creator, the supreme ruler of all. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. Psalms 19:1 and 2. The beauty that clothes the earth is a token of God's love. We may behold it in the everlasting hills, in the lofty trees, in the opening buds, and the delicate flowers. All speak to us of God, the Sabbath ever pointing to him who made them all. Bids men open the great book of nature and trace therein the wisdom, the power, and the love of the Creator. Go out, enjoy nature on the Sabbath. There's not a thing wrong with it. When we moved to Indiana, of course, I was 10 years old when we moved from Kentucky to come up here. We moved up here, and I thought that everybody observed the Sabbath the same way. Now, I'm coming from a big church in Louisville to the North Vernon Church, down by the tracks, which is a lot smaller than what it is here. But I noticed some differences. Had a friend that when I went over to his house on Sabbath afternoons, and his mother went to church too, she'd be watching her TV. I saw that. Whoa, that's not right. There was one man that played basketball on the Sabbath. Got a group of friends together and went and played basketball. I asked him about it once. I says, how can you justify playing basketball on the Sabbath? He says, oh, it's good fresh air. He says, you're out, they played outside, it's out in the open. He says, you're breathing good. I question that too, because whenever I play ball, I don't care if it's a game of horse or in a pickup game or whatever, my thoughts aren't on God. It's about making a basket and about winning the game. Even if I'm watching sports on TV, I want my team to win. My thoughts aren't concentrating on God at that time. That's why I won't watch sports on TV on the Sabbath. When I moved to Anderson, one day I was over at my in-laws' house, and here up rides the elder of the church and his family, all on bicycles. He's a good friend of mine, so I asked him, I says, listen, I was always taught you're not supposed to ride bicycles on the Sabbath, and here you're an elder of the church, and you're out riding your bicycle? He says, well, it's a good time to spend with your family. He says, we usually ride out in the country and, enjoy nature that way and get good exercise. And then there are some that have swimming pools, and they go swimming on the Sabbath just like they do every day of the week. Now, like I said, I'm not here to question what people do. But what does the Bible tell us? Isaiah says, put away your worldly pleasures. There's a commentary from Matthew Henry. Does anybody know who Matthew Henry is? Okay. He lived from 1662 to 1714. He was a Presbyterian pastor in England. He died when he was 52 years old. But before he died, people say that he wrote the most comprehensive commentary on the Bible, and he died before he got completely through the Bible. He was only through the Gospels before he died. I have looked up and read his comments, and I'll tell you, he has inspired me. On Isaiah 58, 13 and 14, this is what he says. Now remember, he's a Presbyterian. He never went to church on the Sabbath, as we know the Sabbath. His Sabbath was Sunday. But this is what he's saying about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a sign between God and his professing people, his appointed. It is a sign of his favor to them, of their obedience to him. We must turn from doing our pleasures on that holy day, or from indulging in the pleasures of our senses. On Sabbath days, we must not follow our callings or our pleasures. In all we say and do, we must put a difference between this day and others. Even in Old Testament times, the Sabbath was called the Lord's Day, and is fitly called so still. If we thus remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, we shall have the comfort and profit of it, and have the reason to say, it is good to draw near to God. You know, there was a time that the Sunday keepers, they kept the Sabbath. It was on the wrong day, but they knew how to keep the Sabbath. How many have ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire? Nobody's seen that movie? 1, 2. I have never watched it, and I was doing some research, and somebody had mentioned about Chariots of Fire, so I went out and got the movie. And if you have a chance to see it, watch it. It's a good movie. It's the story of Harold Abrahams, and he was from England, and Eric Liddell, a Scotsman. The story's about the two fastest runners in the world at the 1924 Olympics, these two guys. Now, it brings out in the movie, and I even done read biographies on him, but Liddell was born to a Christian family. His parents were missionaries in China. When he became a teenager, they moved back to Scotland so he could get his education, and he got involved in sports at that time, and he was on a soccer team, and he also ran. In the movie, it brought out a story that there was this kid kicking around a soccer ball, and he went up to him. He says, "Could you come and play soccer with me and show me how to do it the right way?" And Liddell looked at him and he says, "Son," he says, "do you know what day this is?" It was Sunday. He says, "Do you know what day this is?" He says, "This is the Lord's Day." He says, "If you want to come meet me tomorrow," he says, "I'll do it tomorrow, but we're not supposed to be playing ball today." And the kid acknowledged it and went away, and they met on Monday then. When he was going to the Olympics, he was going to be running the 100-meter, the 100 meters. He found out that the qualifying run was going to be on a Sunday. He wouldn't do it. The Olympic committee from England gathered with him, and they says, "It's just this one time." He says, "It's not going to hurt for you to run." He says, "No." He says, "That's not my beliefs." And he stayed strong. Even though they tried to down him and everything else, he says, "Son, your country comes before anything else." He says, "No." He said, "My God comes before anything else." He stood up to him. Well, there was another man, the last name was Montague. He had run in the hurdles and already won a gold medal. He was at that meeting, and he spoke up. He says, you know, I'm scheduled to run the 400 meter. He says, I'll back down so Eric can run in my place. He said, I've already won my gold. I don't need to run another one. And they discussed it and asked Eric, well, would you really be willing to do that? He said, well, I'm not really qualified to run the 400. I've been training for the 100 meter. I don't know if I can last the endurance or not. But he agreed to do it. On the qualifying heap, he didn't do very well. He ran good enough to get to the finals. But when it came to the finals, he broke the world's record at that time in the 400 meter race. See, he put things in God's hands. He let God work things out. If he and Harold Abrahams would have run the 100 meter, only one of them could have won gold. This way, both of them won gold. Harold won the 100 meter, and Eric won the 400 meter. Eric went on to finish his studies. He went back to China to be a missionary himself, and he died in World War II in a Japanese internment camp. You know, we have to stick up for our beliefs. I already went past the 10 after. I've got one more. Is it all right to keep going? I got one more section I need to. Why is this so important to me? Is it really important to keep the Sabbath? I've got a daughter and two granddaughters in California. In 2011, I went out to see them. 2 months before I got there, all three of them were baptized in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It overjoyed me. When I got out there, though, it was very obvious that Rhonda didn't observe the Sabbath. She went to church. She didn't observe the Sabbath. So I talked to her. I says, did your pastor study with you before you was back? Oh, yeah. He studied with us and the girls, and yeah, he was wonderful. I said, did he discuss anything about the Sabbath? No. Just that we go to church on the Sabbath. She was raised in an Adventist home. She knows better. She had some friends that Sabbath come over for lunch. And during the conversation, Rhonda asked, oh, I've been missing you guys for the last few weeks. And the lady said, well, they were about my age. Well, our granddaughter is in cheerleading, and they're having competitions on Sabbath. And we've been going to those. Now, her granddaughter is an Adventist, went to Loma Linda Church, one of the Loma Linda churches. They got a lot of them in Loma Linda. And she made a statement. She says, my granddaughter really misses going to Sabbath school and church, but she really enjoys cheerleading. So she leaves church aside to do her cheerleading. Her grandparents come. They miss church to support her in her cheerleading. I compare that with what Eric Liddell stood up for. This girl is never going to be in the Olympics for cheerleading. Eric Liddell said, I won't run on his Sabbath. What are we doing with our Sabbaths? To me, it boils down to this. What is your pleasures that you do during the week? The list I gave you about how I was raised, those were my pleasures during the week. That's why we didn't do it on the Sabbath day, because that was my worldly pleasures. Can you lay down aside what you do every day of the week, your pleasures during the week, for one 24-hour period to be with Jesus? Is that too much to ask? The reason I'm giving this, I wouldn't be able to give a sermon like this in any Adventist church. There are some that probably would kick me out on my ear. Why? Because they want to do their own pleasure. They want to go to church. They want to be a part of the church, but they don't want to keep the Sabbath. Friends, we're living in the last days. Are we preparing ourselves for it? Denny brought it out in Sabbath school class. He's going to give a sermon in a couple of weeks. I can't wait to hear it. If he's going to be as enthusiastic as he was in Sabbath school class today, he's going to give a good sermon. And I tell you, our Anderson church needs a sermon like that. We need to wake up, people. Time is coming to an end. Are we ready? Thank you.